the city's work we've done to date on the asset management program. So going back to, I think it was about 2010 when we first started the whole process and program then. So what today's presentation will be is just for information, and then the intent is going to be that the information we've done since 2010 up until now that staff will use this fall in the decision-making process for the 2015 financial plan process and going beyond as well. So just the first part of the presentation here will be a bit of a recap on all the asset management work the city has done today. So the program that the city started is based on the InfraGuide best practices. So the National Research Council of Canada puts together various best practices guides on all kinds of different topics, and one of them was asset management. So the program the city has been taking on is based on that program there. So, so essentially what asset management is about, it's about more than just building spreadsheets and models. It's about ensuring that key services in the community can be provided now and into the future. So you want to maintain a high quality of life, a certain level of service for the community that everyone enjoys being here. We've all known the Sustainable Community Plan, Grand Forks. We want to be a vibrant community, looking at all kinds of different things, not just finances and asset management. So it's more. There's caring for infrastructure, and that is sort of the foundation and the backbone of all the services the city delivers, but it is more than that. So, when you think about proactively planning for your financial future, as an individual, everyone's thinking about, okay, can I get through the week-to-week basis? Do I have enough cash to live within my means? But I'm also planning for the future for my retirement, so I'm trying to put money aside for that. And you got enough for when you're 65 and you want to retire, that you can live comfortably and have that quality of life that you desire. So, for local governments and municipalities, it's the same thing. We're trying to put investments into our infrastructure today, but we also got to think about the long term. So, typically municipalities are doing 3 and 5 year financial plans. We want to start thinking about 20 and 25 years and 50 years into the future. There is going to be some looming infrastructure replacements and failures coming up. You can see some graphs later on about that. So, city council's got the legal means and the ability to act as a body on its own to be able to operate and finance these services and the infrastructure and the assets. So, asset management is about delivering the quality services for the community and planning for your financial future. So you may recall, some of you, back in 2010, we developed a asset management investment plan, also known as the AMIP. So what that was a 20-year snapshot of all the city's infrastructure and what the cost would be to replace that. So what we looked at was the needs and timing based on the age and the theoretical service life of that infrastructure. So we took all the city's assets, all the water, sewer, roads, the electrical utility, the buildings, the facilities, the fleet, put that all together and used current unit rates on that information the city had in its TCA database. And the city owns about $127 million in assets. Based on those age and condition and theoretical service lives, there's a deficit of $32 million. So there's $32 million worth of infrastructure that's past that service life. Doesn't mean it's failed and there's sewage running down the streets or anything like that. But it's older than what its design service life is. So for an AC pipe that may be 60 years. Right now, some of them may be beyond that 60 years. They're still working, still doing fine. May require a little bit more maintenance, but it is going to fail at some time in the future. When that is, we don't know. So right now, just based on the age and the service life, there's $32 million worth of that infrastructure that could fail tomorrow, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, but it is past that sort of design life. The bulk of that number is made up on roads, which is about $20 million. And then there's $5 million in sewer and $2 million in water. And then the remaining is spread out between the fleet, the electrical, and the storm sewer, and some of the facilities that the city owns. So if you were, oh, sorry, guys.
Scott, when we talk about this now, we're going to talk a little bit more about where council started to look at some risks.
Oh yeah, that'll be about halfway through the presentation. Okay, we'll look at risks.
So then we can talk about, like what the engineers are talking about is the design life, but then we'll talk about how we have to practically live.
Yeah. Okay. I know there's a couple of new members here that weren't around in 2010 when we kind of went through this process. So maybe recap for a few, but good background before we get into risk. So if we were to take all the infrastructure in Grand Forks and take the value of it and spread it out over its service life, you would need to invest about $3.85 million, either into replacements of that infrastructure or putting into reserves for future replacement. So I know you guys have heard Doug mention before, our asset management plan says we need $3.85 million going forward. So that's where that comes from. Back in 2010, we did an assessment. In a perfect world, you have $3.85 million every year going into either reserves or actual capital projects. So most communities, that is a stretch target. It's pretty tough to try and hit that number, but the rest of the asset management program is geared around, okay, how do we get that number down, and we'll find something that is achievable and realistic. So here's a copy of that spreadsheet that you guys all may have seen back in 2010. So again, there's the $3.85 million every year that should be going in there. Of that, $2.9 million is for roads, water, and sewer. So a lot of the work we've done since 2010 has been focused around that, the roads, the water, and the sewer systems, because that's where we can have the most impact on bringing that number down. So what else has the city done? The city has done an asset management financial plan, also known as the AMFP. So that was done in 2011 with the previous CFO. So you may remember some of the presentations that we had done with Cecile on the financial plan, so understanding the costs and revenues for the city. So again, this was a 20-year plan trying to figure out how much revenue can the city generate using your current tax rates, understanding what the long-term implications of that $3.85 million are going to be on your taxes, fees, rates, grants. Is there going to be enough revenue there to be able to fund the $3.85 million and all the other things the city needs to do to provide those quality of service, those services to the community. So some of the key takeaways from when we presented that financial plan was, the city can generate up to $222 million in revenue over the 20-year time frame, but the costs of operations and maintenance and the capital that was planned at the time is $278 million. So there's a financial sustainability gap there of about $2.8 million a year.
Can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
Yeah, a question on that. The financial sustainability gap,
yeah.
$2.8 million a year, is that separate from the $3.85 that would be needed to?
Yeah. So right now, if you averaged out the $222 million over 20 years,
yeah.
The city's probably investing about what would that be, $1 million in renewal between different capital projects and whatnot. But you're about $2.8 million short of where you should be. Yeah. So currently, you may remember Doug's presentation earlier this year. The electric utility is subsidizing a lot of these other funds here. So, the city's done a good job of being able to balance between your general fund, your electric fund, and your water and sewer funds to make things balance year to year. But in the long term, there are some issues and things we need to consider going forward if we want to, be sustainable. Each of those funds being sustainable going forward over the 20-year and beyond period there. So here's another graph. This one was presented then too, just kind of showing the same thing there. So the blue is those the cumulative revenues the city can generate over the 20-year time frame, and the red there is the 20-year cost. So right there. So those $278 million in asset renewal and essential capital projects. So and then the blue line here is just showing there what the cumulative revenue or through borrowing or reserves or grants would need to be in order to close that gap. So again, this here is just another graph that's trying to show how we can close that financial sustainability gap. So what are the things the city can do? So currently, here's your capital funding level for renewal and capital and whatnot. It's about $1 million a year. In an ideal world, we'd be spending $3.85 million on asset renewal. So how can we get that $3.85 million number down and bring the revenue up? So through cost containment measures and revenue generation, hopefully you can find that sustainable renewal contribution number, whatever that happens to be. So, we haven't figured out exactly what that number is. That'll be what you guys do going forward through developing policy and working with staff on the financial plans going forward. So some of the things we can do to increase revenue, you can look at building reserves through taxes and user fee rates, borrowing and debt are options. Maybe it's a DCC program, Doug mentioned earlier. Maybe we look at revising that, bringing that in to, at least on the growth side of things, having developer paying their fair share of things. There's grants you can be looked at. There's economic development. Or maybe there's looking at alternative revenue sources. There could be other things out there that we could be doing, partnerships, joint ventures. Have the city become a little bit more business-minded and look at becoming, something that can generate revenue to help pay for asset management and those essential capital projects. We'll talk a little bit about those in the future, but Peter listed off a couple there earlier this morning around the sewage treatment plant. The other side of the coin is that cost containment. So what are some things we can do to bring down the cost? One of them would be, adjusting levels of service. Maybe not providing such a high level of service in the community. Maybe you don't put sidewalks on both sides of the street. Maybe it's just one side of the street. Maybe the plow cycle times, they go from 12 hours to 24 or whatever it is. Just different things you can do to bring down the levels of service. Could be increasing risk. We'll talk a little bit more about risk going forward here, but maybe it's, instead of replacing a water main when it says it's going to be replaced, you let it extend its service life out until it fails and then you replace it. So you're deferring those costs off into the future. Focusing on the essential projects and not on some of those desirable projects. So, things that came out of the water strategy that my colleague Ken Oliver presented a couple months ago, and then some of the things maybe Peter presented this morning. Those are some of those essential things that are, they're regulatory things that the city's got to comply with in order to meet regulations of MOE or interior health or whatever those governing bodies are. The other thing we can do is focusing on maintenance management and extending the service life of these assets. So a big part of what Public Works does is they're out there maintaining these assets, but if they can think about it in a way that, we're extending the service life of these assets and we're bringing down that renewal contribution number down. So showing the importance of maintenance management and supporting those guys out in the field into extending the service life of all the assets you got there.
Scott, that would touch on that program that we set up with Selkirk College and Asset Management BC and the Public Works Association of BC on the asset management course that City Grand Forks has sponsored with teaching people how to preserve the life expectancy of their assets. And urban systems is a key player in that we're going to be working on cost containment and how do we do that and how do we bring this number down. So our goal is to educate and bring people to our community from an economic development standpoint. That'll hopefully bring this number down a little bit further, just a little bit at a time.
So again, just another graphic here to show that whole cash in, cash out, and how do we balance our costs and revenues and meet the levels of service and plan properly. So again, focusing on cost containment and increasing revenues. You've got $278 million in cash going out over the next 20 years. We've only got $222 million coming in. So maybe we put some of those desirable projects to the side, increase our risk, adjust levels of service. Lots of different things we can do here, but this essentially is just illustrating the same point as the graph before. So what are we going to do going forward? The city has undertaken a few things here in the last year or so we'll start to get into some of the risk work that the city's taken on. So we're going to balance those costs and revenues. So we're going to bring down the cost by funding what must be fixed now and only undertaking those essential projects. So we did the water strategy and the wastewater strategy to understand what are those essential projects need to be done for those two utilities. There was a road corridor condition assessment done back in 2012. So the city has a good handle on the condition of the roads. So the city knows what roads need to be repaired in terms of condition. There's been a lot of effort focused on crack sealing and patching and doing some work on that to try and fix only those essential roads in the short term here right now. The other thing that's done is undertaking a risk assessment in order to prioritize and refine the renewal investments in that AMIP. So if you remember, the AMIP was based on age and theoretical service life, so it came up with the $3.85 million. So what if we consider, let's only focus those renewal investments on areas where there's a high likelihood of failure or a high consequence of failure. So that might include, if there's a water main at the end of a cul-de-sac, you might just let Public Works, let that one go until it fails, and then replace it. But you might have a water main that is downtown here servicing a bunch of commercial. So that's going to have to be prioritized a little bit higher up and may need to be replaced either when it says it's going to be or when you start seeing a lot of leaks. So that one's going to be prioritized maybe a little bit higher up based on some criteria that I'll show you later that we used. And then again, maybe it's considering deferring some of those desirable projects and focusing on the essential and the asset management renewal projects. The other side of it is going to be increasing revenues. So, developing some policies around tax and user rates and fees that align with infrastructure renewal and requirements. So, and also some policies and approach toward borrowing, reserves, growth, and even developing alternative revenue streams. Instead of just taxes and user rates, maybe there's some other things the city could be doing through partnerships and joint ventures to generate some alternative revenues. So again, this fall you'll hear some information from Doug around policy. That'll help guide staff in terms of how we go forward with the financial planning process.
So if I could just touch on that
Sure.
for a sec. When we come into the budget process, a lot of times every year we come into the budget, we ask council, how much do you want to see for a tax increase this year? And sometimes people say 0. How about 1%, 2%? Well, looking at our actual operating costs and this policy would tell us what we need to do. How much of a tax increase do we need to have in order to sustain this? And if you decide to go, say for instance, you have a policy that says you need to have a 4% tax increase annually in order to meet your ongoing deficit. If council decided to work against that policy, they would simply defer that cost out. So one year you'd have an 8% and then you'd have a 0%. So it would give us a little bit of guidance so staff and council wouldn't be going, well, what sounds good this year? It would be more of a business decision. So that's what we're hoping to bring to council later on this year is a policy that will help provide a platform for developing the budget.
Don't have a question.
I know that I've heard at least one other resident talk about the wish to keep the cost of living down in Grand Forks and not to just tax the people. So I and other people are interested in ways to generate revenue, be it a solar farm. I heard Kimberly's got one, and also if there is any way to generate electricity from water coming down the mountain, if there's anything we can do. Because we don't want to make it too high a cost of living here, because then you don't have as much of a tax base if people are needing to live and move because it's a little too expensive to live here. So I hope that we could really explore a lot of options in that way.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the discussion that will happen this fall when setting that policy. Those are the conversations staff and council are going to have. Like, what is that sustainable number? Like either a tax increase or maybe we do look at joint ventures or renewable energy or whatever the case may be. So what are some of those essential projects? You may recall from the water strategy, there was the improving the fire protection within the community. So I believe that's now completed. I think it's the last. Right. In terms of the gensets and the valves and stuff, that's all completed. There's the new well number 6 that was presented to council as one of those essential projects going forward. Upgrades to the east side reservoir. So Interior Health has come out and done an assessment of the reservoir, and they are recommending some adjustments to that one. This is a fairly recent one, so I don't have an accurate cost with me on that, but they are looking for a little bit of protection to that reservoir so that contaminants aren't getting into it. So that may involve putting a roof on that reservoir there, so it is an open reservoir.
And that's new today. Like we've just been learning about this from IHA over the last probably the last 6 weeks. They've been looking at this and evaluating it, and part of this process is to determine how we're going to best tackle this. Dealing with these things. As we've looked at a multi-utility project grant from an asset management piece, but we may be looking at something somewhere else in here because we have these key pieces that we're dealing with.
And a lot of the, Doug's talking about grant programs there, a lot of what we're hearing here coming forward is anything that's sort of regulatory required or compliance oriented may have a little bit better chance of getting some grant funding in the future. So you may want to think about that going forward as the city starts building its cases towards Building Canada funds and Gas Act funds that we're hearing going forward. But Mr. Allen is definitely aware of a lot of those. There's also the 5th Street water main. So there's a water main crossing the Kettle River here that services over to the Ruckles area. So we've done a condition assessment on that one there, and it is definitely near the end of its service life, and the condition of it, the wall thickness on that pipe is fairly thin, and it's a high risk project that may need to be considered going forward in the capital budget. So. And again, Peter brought up the next two here, so the biosolids management and the sewage treatment plant improvements in terms of dechlorination or UV. And then, of course, on the road side of things, there's a lot of roadways that need to be looked at, and specifically 68th Avenue. I think the city is undertaking a bit of a rehab program on there this year, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides down the road here in terms of the risk and why 68th Avenue is being paved this year. So again, and then the asset management, if you just look at the renewal of those existing roads, water, sewer, that's $2.9 million a year for those assets. So those are kind of the essential things that the city needs to think about in the short-term time frame here. The list of projects there, and then those considering the asset management renewal projects. So what else are we doing? So over the course of last year, we did that risk assessment on the linear assets. So we take the AMIP projects and used a prioritization scoring model using the condition of the assets where we had that information and the capacity. So we use the city's hydraulic models and growth rates from the sustainable community plan and try to figure out, which projects are higher risk and prioritize those. So again, risk is looking at the likelihood of failure and the consequence of failure. And we applied a triple bottom line approach to that, looking at social factors, economic, and environmental. So a social factor may be, is the impact mobility of a transportation corridor if there's an asset failure. Economic, of course, would be the cost factors associated with replacing it. And environmental may be, if a sewage main or a force main breaks under the river, does it contaminate the river? So those kind of impacts were in there to increase the modification factors, to increase the consequence of failure scoring. So once we scored all the individual assets, they were grouped into 3 levels of prioritization, with number 1 being the highest priority, number 2 being medium priority, and then 3 being essentially those projects where you would let them run to fail, and public works staff would only replace those at the time of failure. So the reason for doing a lot of that too is the AMIP was based on the age and the service life of those projects, and basically said you got $3.85 million that needs to go into this. So how do we know which projects and when, using risk and all the best information we've got, we were able to bring that number down. So that $2.9 million for the renewal of linear assets, if we just focus on the priority 1 projects, so those high risk projects, ones that are going to have a high likelihood and a high consequence of failure, the city could be investing about $700,000 a year instead of $2.9 million into asset management. So, the majority of these projects are driven by condition or the age of the project, not so much the capacity. So with a growth rate of around 1% in Grand Forks, a lot of the pipes are adequately sized right now. There are a few in the community that do need to be upsized in the future if there's some growth, specifically in the West End. But a lot of the projects are conditioned.
Could you take the question from
Sure.
In the risk assessment, I'm curious about the water pipes, and I know there was some leak detection done in 2006, and we haven't had any since. Is that it? Is it something we might want to consider to help us also consider the risk with water pipes?
Right. So we did meet with the public works staff and the operators, and they've got leak repair records and leak detection stuff. So we did use those inputs into our model to help
From
assign.
2006
Yep.
testing? Okay, what about the possibility of testing again, since it was 8 years ago?
Yeah, that would be something the city may want to consider doing again, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just quickly, on the other slide, it said fire protection completed. What specifically was that?
Those were the gen sets that were put on the wells. Instead of building the West Side Reservoir, we added the backup power supply to the wells, so that the city didn't require a reservoir.
So we can-
Mr. Allen and then Mr. Rashagan.
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about, some raised the point regarding the leak detection. Leak detection is a snapshot for that moment in time. That's that moment in time. Right after you've done your leak detection, a leak can break right after that moment in time. Leak detection tells you what's going on then and there. We've done leak detection before. I've done this through the industry, and leak detection is valuable, but there's better science behind it. And I think what we're doing is in our process right now, and leak detection is important for us. But we're going to be able to refine this a little bit more down by neighborhoods with our district metering plan that we're implying. We're going to be implementing over the next several years. But what it's going to do is help us figure out which neighborhoods, and then work with the science that the engineers are telling us and saying, you know what, the risk factors are true and correct, and we need to be focusing on this area. Versus the potential that they may tell us that the risk factor is high, but the likelihood is low because what we're finding is there is no leaks in those areas. So we're combining that, and the engineers will provide us with the science. But at the end of the day, I mean, and I'm not saying that the engineers are wrong, but I've seen them say that a pipe is fully, the life expectancy is fully exhausted, and we've done some destruction testing. Scott and I working together on another project where we found that there was full life expectancy left in the water pipe. So it tells us something, but it doesn't tell us everything, and we have to have a little bit more science before we start going and investing this type of big money into these things, because it's important that we don't simply replace the car because the windshield wipers are broken. You know, we've got to make sure that we have a full case for replacing the car. So that's something that's important for us to understand, and we're going to get a greater understanding of that over the next little while.
Right.
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, the $700,000 a year doesn't mean you go and build those projects. It's, you know, Public Works go in and take a look, you know, is it right now, or is it still 5 years out? So maybe it's leak detection or CCTV, or take it up and take a look at it. Whatever it is, you know, have the operators make comments on that. Is it actually something that is going to fail the next year or two, or is it still maybe have 5-10 years or full life expectancy in it? But based on the science we've done, it is a higher risk project than other ones in terms of either the likelihood or the consequences of that failing.
So to follow up, Mr. Allen, though you are in favor then of district metering because it'll let you know certain sections perhaps of pipe that might have more leaks, which might be good to address. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We've been talking with Urban Systems over the last year about sharing the cost with several municipalities on the district meters, because it's another asset that we don't want to acquire, but we have to figure out how we can do this, because other communities that have water meters in the community, the district meter complements that and allows you to do this to some difference. So if you take the difference from the home to the district meter, you can simply do an equation, and it'll tell you how much water you're losing in that neighborhood based on other factors. So what you're able to do, the district metering complements it. So it's definitely the new science that we're dealing with. So along with the residential water meters and the or industrial or ICI meters, it'll allow us a greater understanding of our water system, that we can actually fully audit our water system.
Don, I'm not sure whether Mr. Shepherd wants to go into in-depth questions. Do you have much more to present, Don?
Yeah, there's about 7 more slides, so there is a bit more to go.
So you want to wrap that up, Donna?
Okay, I'll try to say it quickly. With protecting the environment, including the water, the key thing is reduction. And that means not buying things, using things unless you need to, and including water meters. Now, my understanding with district metering is you can have temporary meters. I just wanted to say residential water metering makes a large environmental impact at the time of implementation as well as ongoing if you're going to keep it up. So I just wanted to bring that to the awareness that, and as far as how the meters contribute to pollution, it's in extraction for making them, transportation, all those parts, replacement, but also in that there's direct water pollution, but part of the challenge on the planet right now is when we have air pollution or land pollution and the water goes through it, the water becomes polluted. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, go ahead, Scott. We'll maybe keep the questions to a minimum here until you get through your next slide.
Sure. Yeah, there is a slide at the end where we do questions, so maybe we'll just plow right through till then and
Let's try that.
keep all the questions at the end. So again, just a graphical representation of some of those key takeaways. The blue bar graph there are those priority 1 projects. So those are those high risk projects, the $700,000 a year. What this is a summary of all the projects over the next 20 years. So you can see over the next 20 years, there's a significant amount of investment that needs to happen here. About $29 million in roads, $8 million in water, and about $20 million in sewer. So on average, that's $1.4 million in roads, $400,000 a year in water, and $1 million a year in sewer, if you were to do all the priority projects. So if we just focus on that priority 1 projects, we can, through cost containment and increasing your risk, you can bring that $2.9 million number down to $700,000 a year. So in terms of roads of the risk, a lot of it was on condition based. So ones that had where the asphalt is failing, I got a priority score of 5 out of 5. A priority 2 project would be something that's a future high risk of being under capacity, or maybe it had an existing condition score of 3 based on age, and requires a bit more certainty to try and figure out where it is. So that's things where you would camera the line, or maybe dig it up and do some non-destructive testing, or destructive testing, whatever the case may be. So, if we focus on the priority 1 projects, take a look at those. The city can definitely bring that large asset renewal number down. So all this information and the analysis that we did was done in GIS, so Global Information System software that Urban Systems has. City staff are familiar with it and are actually going through the process of purchasing GIS software for the city this year. So what we created in the interim here was a web map, where it's a internet-based interface, so city staff can go on through a map of the city and click on any asset that you've got here, and the little pop-up box there you see will bring up all the attributes of our assessment on there. So, it's a little bit more focused on at the staff level here, but just so you know, there's the age, the size, the risk scores, the future scores, future pipe sizes that need to be there. So all the information is there for city staff to understand all the attributes of the infrastructure. So if somebody has a question about the water main in front of their place, staff can go on and click on it and find out, what the size is, the material, the age, and the potential, what the risk score is. Is it something that is a priority 1 project, or is it priority 3? You can kind of see at the top here, each of them have been listed as a priority 1, 2, or 3 based on the analysis. So some of the next steps, you've heard us talk about this here a little bit earlier, was developing some policies, setting those parameters for, what's the city's approach going to be to funding asset management and renewal going forward? Is it going to be focusing on priority 1 projects? Is it going to be even taking higher levels of risk than that? Is it going to be building dedicated asset renewal reserves? So maybe you do priority 1 plus putting some money into reserves for the future. Figuring out when is the right time to consider borrowing for funding some of these projects, whether it's essential projects, asset management projects, cost containment. So setting those levels of risk, reducing or adjusting levels of service. And then again, there's some direction around alternate financing. So what kind of grant projects are we going to go for? Are there some new or alternative funding sources that the city could be looking at? Again, just a little bit more detail there on the capital improvement side of things. Is it focusing on the priority 1 projects and developing maybe an integrated strategy for funding renewal and those essential projects? Figuring out what that sweet spot number is in terms of that sustainable renewal contribution for capital projects. So closing that funding gap, maybe it's saving for 50% of the AMIP number, that $3.85 million. Maybe the city wants to save $1.9 million. So you're budgeting for capital renewal and reserves, developing strategies for setting sustainable rates and taxes going forward. So taking a review of your water and sewer fees and rates, they become self-funded utilities. work towards a solution that's not going to be reliant on grants. You know, as we've seen over the last 3-4 years, there hasn't been any grant funding for communities on the capital side of things. There may be a Building Canada program coming out in the near future, so there could be some capital monies going forward, but we got to think that that's probably not going to be a sustainable thing for you know, for the province and the feds going forward. You know, we always got to consider our ability to pay before we implement any changes. So, you know, what is, you know, the residents' ability to pay? You know, so doing some communications that we talk about down below here.
And this is going to be an important piece here, is asking the community what do they want. We heard some members of the public suggest that we want to keep taxation low, but do we replace some of the decisions sometimes are going to be, do we replace the sidewalk, or do we simply put in the curb and not replace it? I mean, we have to ask ourselves that, but we also have to ask the community what do they want. So part of this piece would be asking the community, do they want to see their taxes continue to climb, or how do we find that balancing point? So asking them, do they want to see sidewalks on both sides of the street? Or do they want to see the travel lanes for the vehicles to be 4.3 meters wide versus 3.7 meters wide? Where can we go there, and how do we save in the long term?
Yeah, so traditionally, like we talked about earlier, you know, typical municipalities think in the short term, you know, you got your 5-year financial plan. You're not evaluating the long-term financial health of your community. So a lot of these policies and plans and stuff will help the city, you know, be thinking long-term about the finances there. You know, so the burden is not being passed on to future generations, and, you know, the sustainability of service levels and finances are considered today. So what are we going to do going forward this year? So today's information is going to be used, like I talked about earlier, to form decision-making around, you know, the 2015 financial plan. Council will be engaged by staff to figure out, you know, to help out. Okay, what are some policy and directions from council that we can give to staff around risk? Funding asset management, funding those essential projects. So one of the projects going on this year, and I skipped over it earlier, is 68th Avenue. So during our analysis, you know, that came up as one of the higher priority projects in terms of a multi-utility project, looking at the water, the sewer, and the roads. The roads came out really high, the water and sewer were sort of medium. So, you know, does the city want to take a higher level of risk on that project, or take lower risk and replace all of it? So replacing all of it means spending upwards of, you know, $1.2 to $1.3 million. If you just do the roads, maybe you're spending $400,000 or $500,000.
I was going to touch on that a little bit further, Scott. So one of the things that we have to talk about here is when we look at this, this as a, you know, we'll put it into a bit of a scheme. Right now, we've got the cost come in. It came in for the road replacement surface. Sash, what was it at? 380,000. Well, 400,000.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about here is replacing the asphalt surface and the undercarriage of the road. So the subsurface of the road is basically where all the deterioration happened. And what we're talking about here is this being a low risk for us. If everything works out really well, we're going to talk about this being a risk level of 1. What we're suggesting here is the pipe underneath here will potentially last, if council wants to take the risk, it'll potentially last the life cycle of this pavement surface. Pavement surface will last another 20 years. So typically a pavement surface will last that long in an arterial roadway. What we want to see here is we're saying to council that this pipe is due to be replaced. But we've looked at it and we've said that there really hasn't seen many structural deficiencies in it. What we're saying is, let's take this risk and let's evaluate this. Rather than putting aside $2.9 million a year, because the ideal situation would be, like Scott said, put in $1 million, or sorry, I'll put $1 million in here, and that would be the ideal situation. Put in $1 million and it's guaranteed that it's going to work. But if we only, and I use the analogy that if we only need to replace the windshield wipers on the car, let's just do that. Let's see if we can stretch this out a little bit and amortize that over a few more years. That brings this amount down. So that's what we're doing, is talking about taking risk. The reality is, as we go into here, we might find that we get a crack in the pipe somewhere in here, and we have to repair that. But essentially, and that might drive the price up to $480,000. These are just hypothetical numbers, except this is, we did the tender for this project, and it came in at, I believe, close to $400,000. But the risk factor for us is minimal. But what we're doing is we're trying to stretch out the life of the asset, and that's what we want council to consider over the next few years. Is simply replacing it brand new is the ideal situation. If you were buying a new car every time, you're guaranteed you're not going to have, or you're less likely to have breakdowns. But if we simply move ahead and replace the wipers and we replace the brakes and we stretch out the life of that car, it'll last a little bit longer, and we do have a little bit more maintenance to do. but at the end of the day, it requires less of a capital investment. And we stretch it out and we exhaust the life expectancy of our assets, rather than just replacing it for the sake of replacing it. And I appreciate what the engineers bring to the table in that respect, but there is a time where council has to be practical in that, and you might stretch out the life expectancy of your car, or your tires, or the roof on your house. But this is what we're facing right now, is this. We're gonna replace this. We may find that we have to do another repair in there, but at the end of the day, it's gonna be way less expensive for us to do this than it is to replace the pipe, because in the future, we can look at our revenue stream and look at this, and we may find that we get another 20 years after this. We'll reevaluate, because we don't really have the factors deteriorating that pipe that we may anticipate. Hot soils, the type of pipe where we're getting the electrical reaction with the ground. We may find that we're getting less vibration, less movement because of the riverbed surface that are around us. So we have to consider all those factors. So what we're suggesting to council is look at it from this angle, and that's going to be our recommendation, rather than simply doing the full replacement, because you can't afford to do the full replacement. And I think that's what we have to come to understand. So that's what we're talking about right now, is taking a little bit higher risk and just spending this amount of money and hoping that, or no, not hoping, but doing a little bit of research behind this, ensuring that we're not just simply replacing it just because the life expectancy said it was going to be 75 years. Maybe we can get 125 years out of it. And that would be our ultimate goal for the community, is to stretch that out, because now we're elongating the life of our assets, and therefore driving this number down, like Scott said, 2.2 million. But my goal would be to take it down even lower. And what is the high consequence here? What's going to be the likelihood of problems for us if this pipe does fail? We're not going to be in a situation where we're going to be in loss of life. The socioeconomic component of it, we have alternative roadways to go around it while we're repairing it. So we're not going to be in a significant loss. So it's just something for us to look at, and that's what we've been talking about with urban systems, is saying, how do we balance this? So that's what I have here for you. Is there any questions on that?
Yeah.
Don?
There are a number of residents who have felt confusion and concern about that approach, because many years ago that road was identified as a road that needs to have its water pipes replaced soon. And also there's many wondering, couldn't we use our gas tax money to do it all rather than do it on the water meters?
No. That was basically the gist of everything that Mr. Allen just got finished presenting. So no, it doesn't make any sense for us to spend, whoops, it's gone, the 1 million. But it makes sense to fix what we can fix at reasonable cost.
But there'd be no risk. You have it all fixed. You know your water pipes were good, your sewer, your roads.
And all our money would be gone.
But you'd have it invested in your infrastructure that you could count on.
Exactly. Thank you.
So just the last bullet here is one of the other things to consider is developing a communication strategy for achieving those higher levels of cost recovery and achieving that financial sustainability. The Canadian Water Association just completed a survey going out to a number of the water purveyors around Canada, and the number one concern that they came forward with was public communications and engagement plans around going to full cost recovery. So you're going to start seeing this a lot more. BCWWA is going to be doing the same kind of push here in BC. So full cost recovery of utilities, be self-funded and not relying on other funds, the general fund or the electric fund, to subsidize them. So that's the kind of stuff we're going to see going forward industry-wide.
That's essentially what's happening in our community right now. Our electrical utility is funding the water system, and with the implementation of water meters, it'll allow residents to pay for what they use individually. And it keeps the water utility as a standalone utility, rather than it being subsidized via the electrical utility. And the same thing is happening with the sewer utility. It's being subsidized through other aspects of the organization. What's happening is we're taking the money that we should be putting into renewal of those things, and we're taking it from over here, and we're simply doing a shell game over the last many, many years, where we're not actually running the business the way that the new requirements are suggesting that we should be doing it. And it allows us to keep those utilities standalone and separate, so we're not looking at this. Now, what we're going to be able to do is look at other streams of revenue that council can say, okay, well, how are we going to do this? We're going to put it all into renewal. Council will look at where they're putting their revenue streams in the future. So it'll allow for a solid business case. And like I said, this has been happening in this community for basically since the inception and moving through because we don't have the reserves in place that we should have
for these different types of utilities.
There we go. Now here's your slide. Questions?
I understand from reading literature about Peachland that some people thought they had a tax revolt after their water prices went up, and they decided not to accept a gift from the government of 2/3 of the cost of a curling rink, and then the prices were going up again. I understand the idea of having the utility pay for itself, but that's done in a way where people pay more for water. And I see water a little different from other things, and I just want to ask you some questions that you can hear the answer in your head. But long ago, were people able to survive without gas? Long ago. Long ago, were people able to survive without electricity? Long ago, were people able to survive without water? So I hope those questions help you understand why myself and others are concerned about raising the price of water. Regarding water, me as a resident and a taxpayer, I see it as different, that maybe it is okay to pay for the infrastructure replacement in a different way. That's the most expensive part of the water delivery. It isn't actually the chlorine and the electricity. So I say this is just a way to not separate the rich and poor, and I see water differently, and I'm grateful you're giving me the chance to share this with you, but I'm not so sure that, I personally don't think we should have it done that way regarding water, because it is different from other things, and I would really be grateful if we could have more discussion as a community and let the community decide whether they're okay with approaching water this way. Do you have other communities that are having these kinds of issues or questions regarding water and the approach of making it self-sustaining?
Yeah, I mean, all the communities that we're working with, they're all moving towards self-funded, self-sustaining utilities. So that's the way it's going. I mean, you talk about water, the water is actually free. You could go to the river and get water for free. It's actually the delivery.
I can't go pump out of the river.
The cost is the delivery, the level of service that people are receiving.
But
right?
the volumetric price, really, if we were to think about volumetric, should only be the electricity and the chlorine. The rest is the infrastructure price. That would be a set rate. That would be what would make the most sense if we're really wanting things to fund themselves. So I have an aversion to setting the rates volumetrically, to charging for water that way, because we need it for survival. And we invested in the infrastructure before, and we kept water affordable and accessible for all. And I have confidence and belief in our community that we could actually decrease our water use through education and other approaches.
We have heard this time and time again, and I think we're putting Scott in an awkward position at this point by arguing the ethical issue here of conservation or control. So if that's it, Mr.
Yeah,
Shepherd,
that's it.
A motion from council to receive the report. Councillor Smith. All those in favor? And that being the end of the session today,
We have an in-camera meeting that one.
yes, in camera following this fairly quickly. So thank you all very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you.